Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to what is the fourth session at the Piazza Pavilion today. And it's with personal pleasure that I'd like to announce this session. That's Cricket and Nationalism. And we have Mike Brearley, Shashi Tharoor, and Ashok Ferrey in conversation with Ashis Ray. I now hand it over to the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ashis Ray. Welcome, everyone. What a wonderful setting here at one of the greatest depositories of books, where every cricket book worth its salt is stored, and on a sunny Saturday afternoon to discuss a topic which has become topical, which is cricket and nationalism. And let me first introduce the panel, all of them distinguished people, well known in their crafts, and starting with the cricketer himself, Mike Brearley, played for Cambridge, Middlesex, England, captained all three with distinction, went on to become a writer and author, and then president of the MCC. He thereafter also became the chairman of the World Cricket Committee of the MCC, and not to mention the fact that he's a psychoanalyst.
It's funny when you pause between psycho.
Yes.
And now to Shashi Tharoor, who, to his great distinction, went to the same school that I did, St. Xavier's, Kolkata, which produces the Bright Boys. Went on to study at St. Stephen's College, at Fletcher School at Tufts, had a very long and lustrous career at the United Nations as an official there, went on to become an under-secretary at the UN, and now, as many of you know, he's twice been elected from Thiruvananthapuram. I got it right.
Almost. Just one small syllable.
To the Indian Lok Sabha, which is the House of Commons in India. And now, of course, to Ashok Ferrey, who comes from Sri Lanka. He was born there and then grew up in East Africa and Sussex. Went on to study pure mathematics at Oxford, but then has decided to become a novelist. He's the most successful novelist Sri Lanka has produced. His most recent book being, and let me read it out, The Ceaseless Chatter of Demons. So welcome, Ashok. Welcome to you, Michael and Shashi.
Thank you, Ashis.
And so let's kick off by taking you back to the 19th century. In 1882, on the 29th of August, England lost a test match to Australia. On the 2nd of September, 4 days later, there was an obituary in the Sporting Times which said, and I quote, "In affectionate remembrance of English cricket, which died at the Oval on 29 August 1882, deeply lamented by a large circle of sorrowing friends and acquaintances. R.I.P. N.B. The body will be cremated and the ashes taken to Australia." Unquote. Why do I raise this? Obviously, in the pain and anguish the English felt by being defeated by Australia, I was wondering, Michael, whether there was also a loss of pride in what happened, and therefore a puncture of nationalism.
Yes, can I just say that they lost by 7 runs? and the match is most famous for the venerable spectator in the pavilion who gnawed through his umbrella in the tension of the close finish. But yes, actually, what you say links with what I wanted to say too. Perhaps the first thing I wanted to say, which is to do with shame, humiliation, and retaliation. And I think that's at the root of a lot of nationalistic hooliganism, let's say, whether it's by players or spectators. And I think it's, that if you put 22 young men into a field and you give them a hard weapon to play with called a ball, and you say, these are the old enemy, and it's all hyped up by the media and the history and the tradition and the crowd and everything, and you expect them to behave as if it's a vicarage tea party, you'll probably be disappointed. And you might occasionally get gang warfare. And the gang warfare, often with
Sandpaper.
adolescents.
With sandpaper.
Sandpaper and other items, indeed, yes. But it is a matter of feeling humiliated by loss or defeat or by being pushed off your pedestal. And then the only retaliation you have is to do the same but harder and force it back down the throats of the other side. And I think that's what happens quite often.
So in other words, that being the first sort of international contest, England versus Australia, in the 19th century, could be attributed to be the beginning of nationalism in cricket.
It probably was. I mean, I don't know if there was nationalism before that, but it certainly it started it going in a big way.
Well, certainly in cricket we can conclude. And let me go on to tell you the rest of the story. Ivor Bligh, who was captain of England, then toured Australia the following winter. And he vowed before he left English shores that he would recover the Ashes. And so England went out there, won the series, and what happened was some ladies, and this is one version of the story, there are other versions. This version says that some Australian ladies burnt a bale. I'm sure you're familiar with the bale on top of the stumps. And the ashes were put into an urn, and that urn was presented to Ivor Bligh. And from there emanates the trophy, the Ashes. Now, to take it forward, Shashi, you as an independent Indian, shall we put it this way, how do you see this rivalry between England and Australia?
Well, with some amusement, because they're playing a country they haven't actually fired at least not deliberately. Whereas in India, we actually, have played cricket matches against a country we've been to war with 4 times. I mean, that's somewhat more serious when it comes to cricket and nationalism. I would also say that India versus England had probably more nationalistic overtones than England versus Australia, because ultimately they were the same sorts of people, a slightly different accent and a different geography, but they were essentially descended from the same lot. And that's why if you look at the cricket records, there are lots of people who played for both countries in the early years, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But if you were to look at the India-England issue, when the British brought cricket to India, it was really they playing amongst themselves. And the Indians were just groundsmen and ball boys and that sort of stuff. And when Indians started picking up the sport, initially it was only as bowlers. Then the aristocrats came into the sport, and they, of course, enjoyed batting, and they had their staff to run after the ball for them. But when the Indian aristocrats started studying here, they started playing for their schools and colleges here and demonstrated they were good enough to hold their own. And one of them, as we know, became a legend in that he was picked to play for England, K.S. Ranjit Singh ji, scored a century on his debut. And suddenly the exotic Indian aristocratic cricketer batsman playing for England became an issue. Back at home, of course, the English were still largely playing amongst themselves, but Indian tournaments began to rise. And suddenly matches started happening that pitted Indians against Englishmen. And this is where nationalist pride started coming in. Your own state of Bengal, Bengalis took up cricket very much to disprove the British canard that they were a bunch of effeminate babus. This was the way they were portrayed.
The Kuch Bihar family was at the forefront of this
There's a lot of racist writing in that period about Bengalis by the English. And so it was a conscious decision. We must take up a sport and show we can hold our own against the Brits and, if possible, beat them at this game. And when on one occasion, presidency lost a match, presidency, which is all Indian largely Bengali, lost a match to La Martiniere, which was all white. It was practically mourning. And there were editorials written in the nationalist press saying, you've let the country down. And this, I'm talking 1911 or 13 or something. So there was always this element, this edge with the English, which disappeared in 47 to some degree, but which at least I think lasted until we could actually beat them at the game. Once we'd done that a few times and begun to get used to it, then I think the nationalist edge went out of the Indian-English encounter.
Very good point, actually. So it is an interesting narration that the Indian nationalist movement, with the aspiration for freedom, did see the battle against England on a cricket field as part of this nationalism, if you like.
Self-assertion.
Yes, and as far as India-Pakistan is concerned, we will come to it later.
I'm sure we will.
Which is where I think people are most interested in. But Ashok, seeing at it from your perspective, you grew up in this country, studied in this country. I suppose you identify with Sri Lanka more than any other country. But how do you see nationalism from within as well as from an international perspective?
Well, I think we're in quite a sort of strange position. We've always hung on to the coattails of India with getting independence or anything else, and we came to cricket relatively late in the day, or relatively late in the game, shall we say. But when we did, it provided a very, very useful sort of kind of focus for all of us, because Sri Lanka, although it's an island, it's hugely complex, so many layers to it. And so cricket is something that we can all aspire to, everybody there. I'll never forget when Muthaiya Muralidharan, at the height of the war, who was having all this trouble with Darrell Hare in Australia, everybody was behind. He was Tamil. So therefore, essentially, there was this war going, but everybody was behind him. We would have punched any Australian at that stage in his defense.
It's very interesting because what you're saying is that the civil war that was going on in Sri Lanka did not matter, and cricket united Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese and the Tamils and the other communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was extraordinary. I mean, it was when we won the World Cup in 1996. I mean, that was just such this huge outpouring of joy, and you know, everyone for that brief moment there was no war.
So if it's a matter of rivalry, playing another country, where would you see rivalry to be at its height when Sri Lanka play another country?
Interesting, because I don't think we still see ourselves as up there. We are very much the underdogs. I could be wrong for saying this, but I think we are. And so we have these brief sort of periods when we shine, and then we go back. So it's always... Oh, but in
all, I think.
Well, but in our case, it's endemic. So you know, we're always pushing up, and then sliding back down. So we don't really see ourselves as kind of, you know, we don't go into these matches thinking we're fighting a war. You know, we really don't. I think we're very much the underdogs, and when we do sneak a win, then we're rather happy with ourselves.
That's marvelous, actually. That's the way it should be. I don't think we should take it too seriously.
If I could just, with Ashok's permission, one of my favorite experiences of cricket nationalism involved a Sri Lankan colleague of mine in the UN, who had migrated from Sri Lanka to Australia and not just become an Australian citizen, but an Australian diplomat. And he was the one with whom I was watching on television, live, the 1996 World Cup final between Sri Lanka and Australia. So I was very curious as to who he'd support. And inevitably, as the match began, you know, he very correct Australian diplomat working for the UN, he was rooting for Australia. But it was fabulous to watch as the match evolved, the inner Sri Lankan emerged. And there he was rooting for his motherland. And when Sri Lanka won, he was the happiest person in the place. And the footnote to the story is, after all of this experience, he gives up the Australian citizenship, goes back to Sri Lanka, and ends up as Sri Lanka's foreign secretary. There's a national.
Can I go back to something
Yes,
you said? That
Yes, sir.
You used the word exotic for Indian batsmanship, especially Ranjit Singhji.
He never played a Christian stroke in his life.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah, do you want to tell the rest of my story?
I'm sorry.
Somebody also, it was interesting that was a Yorkshire bowler who said that, called Ted Wainwright, and I think he just must have been totally puzzled by him.
Ranji invented the leg glance, didn't he?
Well, that's what they, at least from off stump or offside.
Yep.
I mean, I presume people nicked it down there without, called it a leg glance, but he would obviously do it from the air. And Lord Harris, who was not a noble figure in my view,
But who was governor of Bombay?
Lord though he was, yes, he was the man who said, the professional cricketer is a very fine person, but my God, thank God we haven't got one as captain. You see, the same thing happens within the society as between societies.
Well said.
And, but he said in the 1920s, when England lost some 6 or 8 test matches consecutively, he said that Ranjit Singh had confused England's batsmen by his conjurer's tricks. See, so I mean, even he comes and scores hundreds for England, but he's doing us damage from the inside. There's no limit to...
The Englishman trying to play the glance and the late cut and failing. I suppose that's what it boiled down to.
Yes, well, maybe. Yeah. Maybe it had nothing to do with that at all.
But, well, it's certainly today very much of a 20-20 shot, to play the glance from even outside off stump.
And the late cut from outside leg stump.
Yes. And even...
Inside out scoop over extra cover from
Dilshan,
outside
the
the leg.
Dilshan scoop, which was an extraordinary... He couldn't have played that without a helmet, mind you.
Yeah,
So, as captain of England, how did you experience the rivalry between England and Australia, the oldest rivalry in the game?
Well, it did feel slightly special, but I think it's all from around the edges of the game, As I was saying before, the media and the history and so on. And so you do feel, because there's so much interest, and because people are so curious and sometimes so it's so vital for them to win or do well, that the pressure seems slightly greater than for other matches or series. But that's about it. I mean, it's all hype, really. It's still a game of cricket, after all, with the same implements and the same activities going on. And mostly the Australians are a funny lot. I mean, I'm not sure we're any more closely related to them than we are to Indians, but then I'm married to an Indian, not to an Australian. So we have some of the same arguments in the kitchen that you had in the 1950s and 40s. But anyway, I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh, the matches were... So the Australians, they play very hard, and they occasionally sledge, but not very much when I was playing. And, and off the field, they're not that much different from anyone else. And some of them have actually become friends of mine, So I think it was hyped up. It did feel a bit different, but it really wasn't.
One Australian fast bowler, Rodney Hogg, said of Michael that he has a degree in people. And that's what the tribute was, for the simple reason that he was a great captain, a great tactician. But let me pin you down a little bit. Are you saying then that expectations in England are greater when you play Australia as compared to other countries?
Yes, a bit.
And how does it happen when you're playing India?
Well, expectations are pretty high then too, but it hasn't quite got that same edge in my experience. And it's something to do also with the character. I mean, I went to Australia to play in the centenary test after being in first India and then Sri Lanka, and we arrived in Perth for one match against Western Australia. And Perth is was then a modern city, and it's very sharp light, and everything is sharp-edged. The buildings are crystal clear, and there's no smog, and there's no cows in the street either, for that matter. and people's logic is different, and we'd been used to the graciousness of most of the Indians we met, and not always, but quite often. And people would carry your bag and stuff like that, and they would be terribly polite and call you sir. And the Australian baggage handlers would say, Yeah, you can pick up that yourself, you know. and
Bleeding
you know,
palm.
Yeah, exactly. And if Tomo don't get you, Lily will, and that kind of thing. You know, there was a completely different, upfront, in your face, as you would know. Everyone would probably know. So there is a totally different style of being, and actually, I don't think in itself it's worse or better. It's just different.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things about the spirit of cricket, because it's mentioned in the blurb, is that sometimes it's used, that sort of slogan, is used to justify very regional or class attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're the ones who know. We're the Edwardians, and we're the white British Edwardians, and we know what's right, and you people behave in this funny, exotic, lots to say, unchristian way. And it can come the other way as well, by the way. You know, it goes both ways. But it's, on the other hand, there is such a thing as the spirit of the game, and that is that you play as hard as you can, you respect the opposition and the umpires, and you don't try not to hold it against people too much if you lose, or to triumph too much over them if you win. And there have been great examples of it. You know, the Flintoff one of putting his arm round Brett Lee when Australia had lost by 2 runs at Edgbaston, immediately afterwards. And that took some doing because, you know, the elation and relief and the wish to celebrate with your colleagues must have been very high. And he saw Brett Lee sort of crouching on the floor, and he went and put his arm, weeping, and he put his arm around him. And I thought that was a very civilized thing to do. Vishwanath in a test match calling Bob Taylor back.
That was Bob Taylor.
I think it was Bob Taylor
In
with
Bombay,
both.
yes.
In Bombay. And it probably lost them the match
Yeah.
because they put on 120 or something, 150, and it was the margin. I mean, it was very gracious. I mean, he had no need to do it, but he did it. So there are lots of gestures of decency as well in all cricket matches, and lots of gestures of indecency in small matches away from the madding crowd.
You know, the first test match I ever saw when I was 7 years old was India versus England, 1964. They had so many of their players laid low by stomach trouble that our 12th man fielded for England in a test match. That was Hanuman Singh. So that's a decent gesture. When he cut off a boundary and, you know, saved a 4 that the Indian batsmen were hitting, I was quite upset, I must say. What is the gentleman's game I'm watching?
Indeed, indeed. Is it still a gentleman's game?
Today, he'd probably find some way of diving over the ball so it goes through.
Before I come back to India and Pakistan and Shashi Tharoor, let me ask you, Ashok, in your books, in your novels, that is, do you have characters like an outstanding cricketer falling in love with a beautiful actress?
No, sadly, no.
That happened to you, Mike?
Very sadly. Sadly, no.
Sadly, yes. Sadly, no.
But sadly, yes, as well.
Maybe the beautiful actress fell in love with the cricketer. That's also very likely.
Well, these are things we're not...
Yeah, not.
This is not part of nationalism and sport.
But in my most recent book, I take from real life the hero goes in for his interview at Oxford, and the first question they ask, actually it's the second. The first is, you're Sri Lankan. Second is, oh, you must play cricket then, mustn't you? And the hero has a split second to think, is he going to lie or is he going to brazen it out? And he tells the truth, and he says, no, actually, I'm really bad at cricket. And then at that point, you know, he thinks, well, I've lost the interview. Can I just get up and go? But he does get in.
Is this you?
This actually happened. Yes. That was me.
That's brilliant. But bear it in mind that
yes.
a
One day,
young
yes.
Sangakkara falling
Yes.
in love with a film actress.
Would
I'll
work.
leave that thought with you.
Yes. but actually, on your thing about cricket and nationalism, I mean, at the moment we're in at such sixes and sevens politically, and there doesn't seem to be any strong leader anywhere. There is a huge groundswell, sort of underneath talk of Kumar Sangakkara as a possible leader of the country at the next elections. So it just goes to show that you know, as cricketers, this notion of fair play and justice still do exist. So the general public do think that they can trust a cricketer far more than they can trust an actor, say, or whatever else. It still exists at home.
You could trust Kumar Sangakkara, I think, quite a long way.
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. You know, I mean, he's a shining example of that.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and he'd make a great leader.
Yeah.
I've done cricket commentary since 1975. That makes me ancient, and I mean test match commentary. And over the years, as a commentator, as a writer, I have felt that the public sentiment expressed in an India-Pakistan match is a little unsavory. It's not really a sporting rivalry. It's like two nations at war. What do you think, Shashi?
I don't think that's entirely fair, actually. I've heard this expression, war minus the shooting and so on. Well, first of all, when war, including the shooting, has taken place, we don't play so lightly with these metaphors. But equally, I would say that there is a keener edge to a cricket competition because there are issues of national pride involved on both sides. But it's not war in the sense of, I don't think either country feels that a victory on the cricket field is going to settle any of the issues between their governments or between their armies or between their territories. This is two sets of people who happen to have more in common with each other than not, but who know they've been divided by history and by various unpleasant experiences, playing a game which therefore has a sharper edge. But I must say that I find it very unreasonable that we put this much of burden on cricket in the India-Pakistan relationship, that every time things go wrong between the two countries, suddenly the first victim is cricket. People say, you can't play cricket. Well, if you can have an ambassador there, you can have businessmen going back and forth, you can have, why can't you play cricket? Oh, no, how can we play cricket when they're killing our people? Well, how can you do all these other things? Yeah. It seems to me that there is an unreasonable burden placed on cricket by the nationalists, particularly, I'm sorry to say, on our side of the fence, because we see ourselves as the aggrieved party, the victims of Pakistani terrorism, and we hit back by not playing cricket, which seems to me to be rather self-defeating.
Yes.
As an independent on this matter.
Absolutely.
What about your Indian wife? Well, she going to like you saying that?
Not completely.
She will get a recording of this.
And my impression, I mean, actually I was going to say something to support what you were saying.
Please do.
was that, you know, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people crossed over from Indian Punjab to Pakistan Punjab to Lahore and were extremely welcomed when they got there.
Absolutely.
And spoke about it with a lot of feeling. And there was, Bishan Bedi told me a story about, I don't know whether he was playing still or
No, he wasn't. This is the 2003-4,
Was it?
or is it the 78-79?
I'm not sure
In
which.
78-79, Bedi was the captain, in fact.
Well, I think it was the later one. But anyway, he went there and he saw in the newspaper this thing, the Dawn, Pakistan Dawn newspaper. He saw something about a child who had an incurable disease or needed a blood transfusion of a strange blood group. And he was the same blood group.
Okay.
And he went into the hospital or wherever it was, or phoned the newspaper and said, look, as it happens, I could give blood for this child, or this transfusion. And he did. And the press got hold of it, or they used it. And he said that after that, he couldn't go into a shop without leaving with a carpet. In other words, the generosity and the gratitude, yes. And the fact that we're all human, after all, we have the same sort of blood groups, as it were, as each other, it sort of meant something.
In fact, lots of Indians told me that Pakistani shopkeepers wouldn't take money from them, yes, or would charge them much less. And in fact, I heard that Pakistanis were pretending to be Indian in order to get the same discounts at their own shop.
Very good.
I entirely agree with Shashi that the hospitality in Pakistan is outstanding. And there are real cases where people refuse to take money at shops, even taxi drivers. I've even noticed in a match in Karachi where Pakistanis, a section, not the entire crowd, supporting the Indian team when Saurav Ganguly took his team out in 2003-4. Which I have not seen in India. I haven't seen any section of an Indian audience supporting a Pakistani team.
Oh, wait a minute. The 99 test in Madras, when the entire crowd stood up and gave a standing ovation to the Pakistanis who just won the match in India? Yeah. Absolutely.
No.
No,
I'm talking about today.
Unfortunately,
sorry. No, I'm talking about today.
Gardens, which used to be a sporting ground,
yes,
is
exactly.
no longer.
I'm coming to that.
No longer.
I'm coming to
our
that.
own people, but
yes, indeed.
Chennai they did.
In fact, I still remember that it was 1979-80 when Asif Iqbal led a team to India, and this was his final test match, and he was out for about 40 odd, and the entire crowd of about 80,000 gave him a standing ovation. Yes, and I do accept your point about the Chennai test, but I feel that there has been a certain generosity, not that it's there in mass proportions, because there's this kind of unfortunate hatred between the two peoples, which I wish went away. But having said that, to ask you a question, since India's age-old foreign policy has been people-to-people or developing, cultivating people-to-people relations, which may have been abandoned today, don't you think it's a good idea to allow, at least as a first step, Pakistani players to come and play in the IPL?
I agree.
And you can talk about international matches later.
Well, I've advocated this myself. That I never quite understood why they were disallowed, because it was actually extraordinary to see, for example, the Calcutta crowd cheering on Shoaib as he came in to hurl his thunderbolts at the very player who was, opening the batting for India the previous week. And here the crowd was rooting for the Pakistani bowler. It was actually very healthy. It would have created a much healthier attitude amongst all our spectators. But unfortunately, this pettiness is very much there in the decision-making circles. They've barred Pakistanis from coming and playing in the IPL. They have disallowed, obviously, any Pakistan tour of India, and they've even refused now to go and play Pakistan in a neutral venue like the Gulf.
Indeed.
I just think this is deeply unfortunate. As I said, it's because cricket is so visible and is so important to the Indian public that they have essentially asked it to carry the burden of all their frustrations with the government of Pakistan, which actually is absurd. I mean, the irony is also that when India and Pakistan meet each other in an international tournament, nobody sits in India saying, how can we play them? They say, international tournament, we can't afford to forfeit that match. We must play them and we must win.
We must buy a ticket.
We must buy a ticket too while we're about it. So there is hypocrisy as well as I think this unreasonable.
I should hasten to add that ties between cricketers have largely been excellent between the Indian and Pakistani cricketers.
Yep.
Even in previous times, and I go back a long time, when the rivalry was more in terms of hockey than cricket, because the great hockey contests of the late 50s and the 60s, where India and Pakistan used to clash, they were the two best teams in the world, and one of them would win, and it would be a great disappointment for the country that lost. But I hope things can be resolved. But you, as a Sri Lankan, how do you see this India-Pakistan rivalry?
Gosh, very difficult. I mean, we are not in possession of all the facts as generally as Sri Lankans. We just see this as a war that in many ways is absurd, actually, because it's, it is one subcontinent. And if it could have survived under the Brits and so many other people, I mean, this, the tribalism and the rivalry, which actually is spreading all over the world now, so perhaps India was ahead of the curve, or India and Pakistan were ahead of the curve here, but in a bad way, I mean, really, it's just absurd. I really do feel, and also to drag sports into it. I really do not agree, as you said, that sports should be made the sacrificial goat for this whole thing. I mean, who suffers? The people, and you're really losing that sense of brotherhood and peace by stifling that.
Yeah, I mean, there was an old story about this, Sri Lankan at a cricket match between India and Pakistan and India. So the Indian hits a 4 and the Sri Lankan applauds, and the Sikh sitting next to him looks at him slightly oddly, and then the Pakistani bowler gets the wicket and the Sri Lankan again applauds. And the Sikh can't take it anymore. He says, are you Indian? The guy says, no. Are you Pakistani? The guy says, no, I'm Sri Lankan. He says, then shut up and sit down, don't move your hands, this has nothing to do with you.
But before we involve you in the conversation, one last point from Ashok. When the Sri Lankan team were attacked by terrorists in Pakistan, how did Sri Lanka feel?
That's interesting. There never was any anti-Pakistani feeling. I mean, I'm generalizing here. It was just a question of being attacked by terrorists. And we've had a lot of that in our own country, so we're really used to it. And in fact, they all got down on the floor, and of course they were shaken and really sort of petrified, I'm sure. But at the same time, it was never a question of the countries attacking us. It was just something, an incident, a terrorist incident that had to be overcome, got over, and you carry on, you know?
Very sensible. And I shall open it out now to anyone who has a question. Yes, the gentleman there, that's the first hand that went up.
Lady here too.
Gosh, lots of questions.
Thank you, sir, for a wonderful session. My question is to Dr. Tharoor and Mike. I wanted to know from both the sides, does politics also affect to get into the nationalism into a sport like cricket? If you take out politics, will it get better for a sport like cricket? For example, if a politician, attending a match, I remember probably half a decade back, Musharraf came to Delhi for a match, to attend a match, and that actually blew up the entire thing. So do you think taking out a little bit of politics, or also politicians, getting into governing bodies like BCCI and even in Pakistan, would it actually affect in any way to actually better the sport? Want to know from both politician and the cricketer, what are the opinions?
Well, there's no question that because of the importance of cricket and the popular following of cricket, that cricket enjoys in both countries, India and Pakistan, there is undoubtedly a consciousness of that amongst the politicians. In fact, when General Ayub Khan conducted a coup in Pakistan and became the chief martial law administrator, he also made himself the president of the board of cricket, whatever it was called in Pakistan, because he saw cricket as a useful vehicle for promoting a nationalist feeling in the new country, as it were, a country that was only a decade old. So you've got this kind of, you've got this identification of cricket with nation building rather than nationalism per se in the Pakistani mind. But you also use the example of diplomacy. And that actually, and it's not just Musharraf, you had General Ziaul Haq came in the 80s to watch cricket in Jaipur. We've had the last, what's his name, Gilani came to I think it was Delhi,
For a World Cup.
Chandigarh, for a World Cup match in Mohali, the India-Pakistan match. We've had other examples. But you have to realize that at that point, there's already a good enough relationship that some sort of dialogue is possible. Cricket cannot be a substitute for substantive diplomacy. It becomes an occasion, it provides another forum, it provides good atmospherics, good photo ops, and so on. But the relationship has to be in a place where the Indian Prime Minister is willing to welcome the Pakistani Prime Minister or President to Indian soil, and vice versa. If that's not there, then the visit will not happen and you will not get the photo op. Do you see my point? So to that degree, politics is important, but let's not exaggerate the extent to which cricket can determine political outcomes. Finally, about politicians and the BCCI and so on, I mean, the fact is that if you don't exclude people from any profession, why this one in particular? I'm sorry to say there are other sports where politicians haven't taken as much of an interest and where you've seen as much, venality or corruption or misbehavior or dictatorial behavior as you might disparage in some of the politicians who've been involved in some of the cricket boards in our country. So I would not be in favor of ruling that out. But as you know, cricket's in turmoil right now. That is one of the issues that's being discussed in the ongoing reform in India. Michael?
I've got a question for everyone, which is nationalism any different in essence from regionalism, religious rivalries of all kinds, sexism? Is it different? Racism? In other words, and I want to tell a little story about what you're saying. On one Ashis tour, it wasn't Ashis tour, it was in Australia, and we were going to play a day-night series, and we in England had never played under lights, and most of the others had played under lights for the Packer matches, and we'd never played with the rules about 35-yard circles and things like that. So we wanted to have a night to practice in Sydney before we played. Quite difficult to get one, but we got one. And so we played sort of from 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 9:30 at night. And we divided our 16 players into 2 groups of 8 and got 3 local lads to come and join and we played against each other. those two teams of 8 became as rivalrous with each other as England and Australia. Here we were, you know, about to play Australia and the West Indies, which was even worse at that time. And we were fighting about the rules. We were fighting about whether someone who, if he was out, could he come back in again? It was a practice match to get used to. And so people in groups get group-ish about it.
Very true.
And, you know, it happens everywhere. It happens for good and for bad, because, after all, we are members of groups, and we're not all on our own. We need groups, and we need collectives, but it happens in bad ways too, so that people can be scornful, violent, unpleasant, humiliating, boorish, hooliganistic, and all the rest of it.
Specifically, what's your opinion on politicians being part of cricket boards or the ICC?
I'm very much against it, because I think they don't usually know anything about cricket for a start.
Some
Maybe
exceptions.
some do. Oh, yes. Present company accepted. They don't know, most of them don't know much about it. And there is a risk of the importation of things that are difficult for people to be independent about within the country. If the foreign secretary or the minister for this is on the board, and it sort of opens the way to all sorts of other manipulations and controls, that it's difficult enough to get straightforward, intelligent, reliable, honest administrators of cricket, even if you don't have politicians.
I've seen many hands go up, so I'll try and do my best in the time allocated. How about you? Yes, Sraboni.
Hi, thanks. I thought a woman should get a question in. Since we're on the subject of nationalism and we are in the UK, I'd like to hear from all the panelists about the Tebbit test.
Ah, I knew it was
Exactly.
coming.
Exactly.
test, Ashok.
Yes.
No. You flunked the Tebbit test?
I'm completely.
Well, I flunk it quite often.
Where?
No, here. I mean, I don't always support England. Why should I? I mean, sometimes England are awful, sometimes they're not admirable, and sometimes other teams are brilliant and gracious and underdogs, and for those reasons, I sometimes support other teams.
Well,
So
that should be the last word, actually.
So I should get on my bike. The other Tebbit thing, do you know? They should get on their bike.
Mike, exactly.
What do you think?
No, I mean, I must say, I'm absolutely, I mean, not only was I born in London, grew up in India and support India, but my cardinal rule usually is support anybody against England. So, except when Mike Brearley was captain, I really liked him. Look, I mean, I think the Tebbit test was actually a fair question, because it went to the heart of questions of allegiance that they were debating in Britain at the time. And I have to say that we haven't needed to ask the same question in our countries, but I think the same question could easily have been asked in India by an Indian politician, or in Pakistan by a Pakistani politician, had we had a significant immigrant group. Because people do feel that showing loyalty to the national team is part of your duty as a good citizen. I mean, this is assumed, right? And I know from my kids having grown up in America, the diaspora Indians and Pakistanis are supporting their mother country teams, even if they've been born in America and brought up, and probably don't know one end of a bat from the other, but they'll be out there. So, because there is this perception that your country's team in a sport that matters to you is about your identity, about your allegiance, about your patriotism. So yes, I mean, I can't imagine not ever supporting an Indian team, and that's why I'm all the more impressed by Mike's very thoughtful and liberal approach. On the other hand, they won their independence a long, long time ago from the Angles and the Saxons or whatever. So.
A lot of English
We're still asserting ours.
A lot of English football fans support Brazil. But having said that, I think it's a fairly good rule, and I'm pretty comfortable as an Indian if a British Indian supports England or Britain in whichever sport. There are, as I said, lots and lots of hands. Let me come to you, Anil. So from right to left, to be absolutely fair.
I think there's a postscript to the Vishwanath story that he never captained India again.
No, but he was never a long-term captain. He was appointed for that test.
No, but I think that had some bearing on it. His extra sporting gesture.
Maybe.
Question to Michael Brearley. When India plays Pakistan, who do the English, as a country responsible for the division of these two countries, who do the English support?
Oh dear.
I know what the safe answer is here. Yes. I don't know, honestly. I mean, I think it might vary too. You know, I think when Pakistan had, what was his name, Qadir, I think one was more inclined to support Pakistan, but Pakistan had some beautiful bowlers. India had some beautiful.
The Freudian slip has given you the answer. From the psychoanalyst, no less.
Well, I think sitting on the fence is what we shall put it as. Yes, the gentleman there. Yeah.
Just wanted to ask a question about IPL. England traditionally has been or was a staunch non-supporter of IPL, if I may put it, because the IPL season used to clash with the early cricket season and they didn't want to send their players to the IPL. So over the last couple of years, I've just noticed a slight change, the most recent being Joss Butler. He was selected back to the English Test team based on his IPL performance. So in a way, is it almost a softening of a hardline nationalist stance towards cricket, specifically the IPL, and now it's almost back to basics?
Well, before I ask the panelists to answer that question, let me put it this way, that normally a selector would not pick a player in a test side based on his performance in a 2020 tournament. But that said, what's your general view, Michael, about the IPL?
I think the IPL is terrific. It's just unfortunate that it has spawned so many other one-day competitions and there are so few windows for Test cricket. And I think the attitude was not, I don't think it was nationalistic, actually. I think it was simply that it runs up to the first tests that are played in England. And no country was confident or happy about losing several of their best players from those test matches or not being prepared for Test cricket. There's enough difficulty getting prepared for Test cricket anyway, with all the one-day cricket everywhere. So I don't know if there's a change or not. Maybe there is slightly.
Ashok, whenever I've visited Sri Lanka, I've noticed that IPL matches are being watched quite avidly. But I do notice that the high level of participation from Sri Lanka in the tournament has subsided a little bit. What's your feelings about the IPL?
I think we love it as Sri Lankans because it's quick. It's test matches are much more sort of solid and slow and very
Test
serious.
match is a novel, my dear boy.
Well, exactly.
ODI
We're
is
all
a short
story
story.
people. We're all short story
And the
people,
T20 is a sitcom.
Yes. He said
Test
it. He
match is
said
War
it.
and Peace.
But you love it in Sri Lanka.
Yes, absolutely.
Very popular.
Very popular. Very popular.
Yeah. You will, of
By
course.
the way, Ashish, your statement wasn't right. When you said that normally selectors don't pick the test side on the basis of T20, not true anymore. The Indian selectors blooded Jasprit Bumrah on the test side purely because of T20.
No, but he also had a first-class record. He had a record in one-day cricket, which were both very impressive. And it was a good pick, yes, I would entirely agree. But it was certainly not based
And
on...
Butler credited the IPL for his success against the first test.
Well, what the IPL does, I suppose, is A, makes you into a good fielder, and it helps you in tight situations, which is why I think an Indian cricketer today is very good when it comes to international cricket in a tight situation, because temperamentally, psychologically, he's prepared, which I think is one of the benefits. There are, of course, a lot of nonsensical aspects about T20, suicidal batting most of the time, and so on. But the next question. Yes, the lady there at the back.
I just wanted to ask, so do you ever think we'd see a day when we see nationalism infiltrate women's cricket as much as it does for men's? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Interesting, interesting. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, there's a good form of nationalism and a bad form. I mean, there's a good form that has something to do with patriotism, love of your country, love of whatever it is, and doesn't necessarily mean disparaging other people. And it seems to me that, you know, the Women's World Cup final, which was a great day at Lord's last year, England versus India, a very close match. England just won, as it happens, but it was a great day's cricket, full of totally different people at Lord's, different atmosphere, and something about the sort of freshness and spontaneity and not artfulness, less artful in a certain sense, attitude, or less cynical perhaps, attitude of the players that was very refreshing. So that seems to me a good form of patriotism or nationalism.
Except that in India, people who'd never watched women's cricket in their lives tuned in because it was an Indian team in the World Cup final.
Yes.
And they watched, and these women cricketers became stars because of that nationalist feeling that we might win the World Cup. So there is still an element of that.
Yeah. So we come back to the colonial legacy. And what about you?
I think if we'd got to the final against any country, it would have been the same thing.
Fair enough, fair enough. Women's cricket in Sri Lanka?
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, I could be shot down for saying this. I genuinely do think women are less tribal than men. You know, so there isn't that, they're more sophisticated about it and a bit more honest. So you're not willing to throw away all your reasoning just so that you side with these people because they belong to you, you feel they belong to you. So I think it's a much more even-handed match. It's my
Yes, I think it's more graceful, it's more elegant. I think men's cricket has become a little sharper, but then you would expect it to be, wouldn't you? Because sport which was discovered and people started playing in the 19th century has to develop over the years, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Yes, the gentleman there.
Just a point on that England-India World Cup final. Mike. Oh, sorry. With regard to that match, just a statement. What really stood out was how empty the MCC stand was. It was England was featured.
You mean the member stand?
Member stand.
Yes.
It was actually stark. And we talk about developing women's cricket, MCC being at the forefront of it. I'm sorry, that was disappointing.
Yes, MCC took a very long time to even allow women as members. So they've been a little bit leisurely in their approach. Yes, the lady there. Yeah.
Hi. I could go on and on. I have just so many questions, but I'll just say one statement and then a question. First of all, I agree with Shashi about, there is an underlying sense of admiration even across the border, because I remember there's a dream almost all of us growing up in 90s and 2000s had, that Pakistani bowlers and Indian batsmen together could beat anybody. And I was a kid, and my grandfather, I remember 92 World Cup, and I asked him, I was really small, and I still remember, I was like, who should I support? Like Pakistan or England in the final, Imran Khan's team? And he's like, of course Pakistan. You're going to support all the Asian teams against England. So the same thing. Just a very quick question to Michael. I mean, it's not related to nationalism, but his book, Art of Captaincy, which has been pretty popular in India. And I remember that the whole episode with Saurabh Ganguly, and the Saurabh Ganguly's 11 was, and then Chappell and Dravid, and I remember that there was this moment where Dravid was seen on the screen reading Art of Captaincy, and people said, wow, that's great, he's so cerebral. And when Saurabh was given that book, there's an anecdote. He said, I don't really need it. I believe in practice, not theory. Is there anything you could say that, going back, and is there something that you could reflect on Indian captains that, they could have done differently or something? Because a lot of times, even Sehwag or somebody, they always maintain that they don't really look at records, they don't really analyze as much. Is there something you could say specifically that stands out for you?
Well, I mean, I'm sure he's right that it's much more a matter of practice than reading books, but he might have learned something from that book. I don't know.
Over the years, you've played against India, you've watched India, who would you rate as India's best captain?
I don't know. I really don't know. I imagine that Ganguly was up there because he was obviously determined and forceful and clear thinking, and he had a certain sort of pizzazz and style about him. And I think he probably made shrewd judgments, even if he hadn't read the book. So I thought he was probably, he might have been. I don't really know closely enough. I haven't seen Indian teams over long periods, and actually it's very hard to know how good a captain is.
Yeah. Could I throw up a few names for you?
You could, yes.
Patodi,
Yes.
Gavaskar.
Yes.
I would say even Dravid, because his record as test captain was pretty impressive. And I'm sorry, not Dhoni in test cricket. And Virat Kohli.
I like Virat Kohli. I mean, I like him I think he's a wonderful batsman, wonderful, and a very Indian batsman, but absolutely magnificent batsman. But I think he's a very dynamic captain. And I suspect, and I partly got this from Ramchandra Guha, who you mostly know, I expect, but also from, I suspected it. I suspect that he could almost become too powerful in the Indian setup because he's so articulate, so forceful, so brilliant in so many ways. And maybe he needs strong people to counter him as well. But I think I like the way he captains the side.
And we will see him soon.
At the head of those people. I mean, Patodi was obviously also very good. And people like Bishan Bedi said he was the first one to really bring the Indian team together with all the different languages, regions, and make them into a fielding side as well.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, the gentleman there.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. All of you come from such different countries, and yet it seems to me that cricket says a lot about each of your countries. It reveals a lot and it embodies a lot. So what could be more English than a test match at Lord's, or what could be more Indian than a one-dayer at the Chinnaswamy or Murali bowling at Gould? So my question is, cricket is one game, it's the same rules all around the world, but how does it reveal so much about different countries and embodies so much about different countries?
Quick answers from all three, starting with you, Ashok.
I think it shows a certain sort of quickness, I think, and how shall I put this? Malleability, sort of sinuousness. Do I make sense? Yeah. I think that's what we have.
We have a certain stolidity, a certain endurance, a certain craftsmanship, sense of craftsmanship, medium fast bowling, which is, and it's a lot to do with psychology, social psychology, climate, and so forth.
Well, I actually am a fan of Ashis Nandy's famous pronouncement that cricket is actually an Indian game accidentally discovered by the British. So it shows everything about us because, you've got all the dazzling array of mercurial talent, the whole range of it. You've got the fatalism, the dependence on the luck with the toss, the vagaries of the climate. The profoundly Hindu idea that the journey is more important than the destination. So you can play on for 5 days, end up in a draw, but you've had a great experience. So all of that, I mean, it really is very Indian.
I'm afraid I'll have to close it there because time has been ticking and our hour is over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a great audience. And Ashok, Michael, Shashi, thank you very much indeed.